Between September 18th and 20th, 1982, 16 men were killed across Newton County, Arkansas, in what would become known as the Ozark Water War. All adults, all connected by blood through their great-grandfather who'd settled these mountains in 1888. The method was brutal. Chainsaws, hunting rifles, and logging equipment turned into weapons of family annihilation. The perpetrators were the McKenzie brothers, 7 men, ranging in age from 43 to 51, working together like a military unit through 48 hours of calculated violence. Arkansas State Police would later call it the most systematic family elimination in Ozark history. But the reason behind the bloodshed wasn't drugs, wasn't a generations-old feud, wasn't even a dispute over inheritance or money. It was a water well 387 feet deep, drilled 100 feet on the wrong side of a property line that had been disputed since 1896. And one man's unshakable belief that some violations of family land demanded a response, written in blood. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Newton County, Arkansas, sprawled across 823 square miles of the most unforgiving terrain in the Ozark Mountains in 1982. The Boston Mountains rose like ancient barriers, their peaks reaching over 2,000 feet, their valleys so narrow and deep that sunlight only touched the bottom for 3 hours each day during winter. Population stood around 7,000, scattered across hollows and ridges where families had lived in isolation for generations. The county seat, Jasper, held barely 400 souls who knew each other's business, secrets, and grudges, going back to before Arkansas became a state. Most of Newton County existed without paved roads, telephones, or connection to the outside world beyond a single AM radio station broadcasting from Harrison, 40 miles north. September in the Ozarks meant temperatures climbing to 85 degrees by mid-afternoon, dropping to 60 at night when cold air settled into the hollows, like water finding its level. The air smelled like cedar smoke from wood stoves still burning in older homes, mixed with the sharp scent of limestone, springs bubbling from underground rivers that had carved these mountains over millions of years. At dawn, fog rolled through the valleys, so thick you couldn't see 20 feet ahead. The sound of the place was wind, moving through oak and hickory, the distant buzz of chainsaws from logging operations, and the occasional rumble of a truck grinding up some impossible grade in first gear. You could hear a dog barking 2 miles away in the right conditions. Other times, you wouldn't hear a man standing 10 feet behind you in the thick timber. Sound traveled strange in those mountains, following hollows and bouncing off stone bluffs in ways that made distance meaningless. But 1982 was a hard year in Newton County. The timber industry that had sustained these mountains for a century was changing. Corporate operations from out of state were buying up family logging businesses, mechanizing everything, eliminating jobs that had passed from father to son for generations. Small family operations couldn't compete with companies that brought in feller bunchers and skidders that could clear in a day what took a family crew a week. Unemployment in the rural areas hit 40% that summer. Banks were foreclosing on land that had been in families since before the Civil War. For men who'd grown up believing that if you owned land and worked hard, you'd survive. Watching the economy collapse felt like a betrayal of everything they'd been promised. In places like Newton County, land wasn't just property. It was identity, legacy, the only inheritance most families had to pass down. And water, in a county where limestone filtered every drop through hundreds of feet of rock before it reached the surface, water was more valuable than the timber growing above it. A good spring meant your family could survive drought, could water livestock, could wash clothes and fill cisterns. A good spring meant the difference between staying on your land or being forced to sell and move to town, defeated. The McKenzie and Pritchard families had lived within 3 miles of each other in the Buffalo River watershed since 1888, when their shared great-grandfather, Thomas McKenzie, had claimed 1,000 acres under the Homestead Act. When Thomas died in 1912, he divided the land between his 2 sons. William got the eastern section, Jacob got the western section. The boundary between them followed an old game trail that ran north to south along a ridge. Russell Dean McKenzie was 51 years old that September, though. He looked closer to 60. He stood 6 feet even, but decades of physical labor had bent him forward slightly, giving him a perpetual lean, as if he were walking into wind. His build was all wire and tendon, 170 pounds stretched across a frame that had been broken and repaired too many times. His face was weathered like old barnwood, deeply lined around the eyes from squinting through sawdust and smoke. For 35 years, a thick scar ran from his right ear down his neck, disappearing under his collar. Souvenir from Vietnam, a piece of shrapnel that had missed his carotid artery by less than an inch during Tet in '68. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen with arthritis that made cold mornings difficult, fingers permanently stained with chainsaw bar oil that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The index finger on his left hand was half an inch shorter than it should have been, taken by a saw chain that jumped the bar in '73. When he shook your hand, you felt the strength there, but also the damage, the accumulated cost of a life spent working with machines designed to cut through oak like butter. Every morning, Russell woke at 4:30 in the house his grandfather had built in 1923, made coffee in a percolator so old the bottom was worn thin, and sat at the kitchen table smoking hand-rolled cigarettes while he planned his day. He didn't talk much in those early hours, just sat, smoked, drank coffee strong enough to dissolve spoons, and thought. By 5:15, he'd be out the door, checking equipment, planning which section of timber they'd work that day, making sure his brothers knew their assignments. He'd married Martha Louise Hendricks in 1952, right after he came home from Korea with nightmares and that first set of scars. They'd had 4 children. Russell Jr. was 30 now, working the woods with his father. Sarah was 28, married to a man from Boone County. Michael was 25, also logging. Rebecca was 22, teaching school in Marshall. Martha was 50, her hands as work-worn as Russell's, her face still beautiful, despite everything the mountains had demanded from her. She'd buried both her parents in mining accidents back in Oklahoma before moving to Arkansas. And she'd learned early that mountain life took more than it gave. What Russell valued most wasn't money. He'd never had much anyway, barely clearing $30,000 in a good year, split between 7 brothers. What he valued was the land his grandfather had cleared by hand, the timber rights that had kept the McKenzie family fed through the Depression, through wars, through every economic catastrophe the 20th century had thrown at rural Arkansas. The land meant survival. It meant independence. It meant his sons could make a living without bowing to corporate bosses or bank loans or government programs that treated mountain people like children who needed supervision. Russell had 6 brothers, all working the same timber. James was 50, the oldest, built like a fire hydrant with arms thick as fence posts. Robert was 48, quieter than the others, but steady, reliable, the one who kept the books and dealt with buyers. Carl was 46, married with 5 kids, always worried about money but too proud to admit it. Daniel was 44, never married, lived alone in a cabin 2 miles up the hollow. Thomas was 43, the youngest, still trying to prove himself worthy of the family name. And William was 45, named after their grandfather, considered the most level-headed of the brothers, the one who usually talked Russell down from his darker impulses. Together, the 7 McKenzie brothers operated a timber business that brought in roughly $40,000 per year, divided 7 ways after expenses. Not much, but enough to survive if you lived carefully, if you raised your own food, if you didn't expect luxuries. They owned 12 chainsaws, 4 logging trucks, 3 skidders, and 1 portable sawmill. The equipment was old, held together with wire and ingenuity. The Pritchard family lived 3 miles east on the other side of the disputed boundary that had caused tension since 1896. Eugene Robert Pritchard was 48 years old that September, built thick and strong. With a red beard he kept trimmed close and hands missing the tip of his right thumb, lost to a sawmill accident in '76. He ran a similar operation to the McKenzies, logging the western section of the original Thomas McKenzie homestead that had passed through his grandfather Jacob's line. Eugene had 7 brothers and 1 son, all working timber. Marcus was 45, the oldest after Eugene. Frank was 43, considered the hothead of the family. David was 41, married to a woman from Missouri. Leonard was 39, quiet, devout, read his Bible every morning before work. Carl was 37, divorced, drank too much on weekends. Raymond was 35, married with 3 kids. And Stephen was 33, the youngest brother, still living with his mother in the old homestead. Eugene's son, Eugene Jr., was 26, recently married, expecting his first child in November. These weren't strangers. The McKenzies and Pritchards were related through their great-grandfather Thomas. Russell and Eugene were technically second cousins. Their children played together when they were young. Martha McKenzie and Eugene's wife Carol had been friends once, before the boundary dispute made friendship impossible. The families attended different churches now, but they'd attended the same one until 1976, when a disagreement over timber rights made sharing pews unbearable. The boundary dispute centered on 100 feet of forest that contained the richest limestone spring in Newton County. The spring produced 5 gallons per minute year-round, never running dry even during the terrible drought of '80. Both families claimed it. The 1896 survey was vague, referring to landmarks that no longer existed. The old game trail had been obliterated by logging roads. Modern surveys disagreed depending on which surveyor you hired. The McKenzies had documentation suggesting the spring sat 100 feet inside their boundary. The Pritchards had equally convincing documentation suggesting the opposite. For 86 years, both families had shared the spring through an unspoken agreement. The McKenzies drew water on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. The Pritchards drew water on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Sundays, neither family touched it, respecting the Lord's day and each other's needs. It wasn't a written contract, just mountain custom, the kind of arrangement that worked because both families understood that survival sometimes required cooperation, even between people who didn't particularly like each other. But the drought of 1980 changed everything. By July of that year, smaller springs across Newton County had dried to trickles or stopped flowing entirely. Cattle died in pastures where grass had turned brown and brittle. Wells that had never failed suddenly pumped nothing but air. The shared spring became more than convenience. It became necessity. Both families increased their water usage, filling larger tanks, watering more livestock, irrigating gardens that would determine whether they ate vegetables that winter or went without. By August, tension over the spring had escalated. Arguments broke out over whose turn it was, whose livestock needed water more urgently, whose children should have priority for washing. The unspoken agreement frayed. Eugene Pritchard proposed drilling a well on his side of the disputed boundary, eliminating the need to share. Russell McKenzie opposed it, arguing that drilling so close to the spring might affect its flow, might reduce the water available to both families, might destroy the one resource that made the land valuable. The dispute went to Newton County Court in March 1981. Judge Harold Mitchell examined both families' documentation, reviewed survey maps from 4 different surveyors, and ultimately ruled that the boundary question was too complicated to resolve without expensive litigation neither family could afford. He suggested mediation, compromise, continued sharing. Eugene Pritchard left the courthouse believing the judge had sided with the McKenzies by refusing to clarify the boundary. Russell McKenzie left believing the court had failed to protect his family's legitimate claim. By winter of 1981, the families had stopped speaking entirely. The sharing arrangement collapsed. Both families began drawing water whenever they needed it, leading to confrontations at the spring. In February, Eugene's son threw rocks at Russell's truck. In April, someone cut Russell's water line. On August 12, 1982, a Thursday morning when temperatures hit 92 degrees by 10 a.m. and humidity made the air feel thick as cotton, Russell McKenzie was checking timber boundaries 2 miles north of his house when he heard the unmistakable sound of a drill rig. The rhythmic pounding carried through the forest, echoing off the limestone bluffs. He knew immediately what it meant. Someone was drilling a well. He drove his truck down logging roads barely wide enough for the vehicle, following the sound. At 11:15, he emerged from the tree line and saw Eugene Pritchard's operation. A drilling rig mounted on a flatbed truck, surrounded by Eugene, his brothers Marcus and Frank, and his son Eugene Jr. They'd cleared a space 50 feet in diameter, cut timber that Russell believed belonged to his family, and were drilling into rock that sat, by Russell's calculations, exactly 1 108 feet inside McKenzie property. Russell parked his truck across the access road, blocking the only way out. He stepped out slowly, leaving his rifle in the cab, but keeping his hand near the door. Eugene saw him immediately, shut down the drill, and walked over. The two men stood 15 feet apart in the August heat, decades of shared history and recent hatred between them. Russell's voice was quiet, controlled, almost polite. "That's my land you're drilling on, Eugene." Eugene shook his head. "Survey says different. Judge wouldn't rule either way, so I'm solving the problem myself. Got a right to water my own property. You know damn well that spring sits on my side. Your grandfather knew it. Your father knew it. You know it. I know I'm tired of arguing about it. I'm tired of watching my cattle die because you won't share water that runs under both our properties. This well solves everything." Russell looked at the drill rig, at the hole already 50 feet deep, at the disturbed earth and cut timber. He felt something shift inside his chest, a cold settling that he recognized from Vietnam, from moments when you understood that violence was inevitable, and the only question was when and how. Russell drove home without another word, leaving Eugene and his brothers standing by the drill. He spent the afternoon in his workshop, sharpening chainsaw blades, checking equipment, saying nothing to Martha when she asked what was wrong. He called his brothers that evening, asked them to meet at his house at 8 p.m., told them to come alone without their wives or children. They gathered in Russell's living room, 7 brothers sitting in chairs and on the couch in the house where they'd grown up. Russell told them what he'd seen. James, the oldest, immediately understood the implications. He's claiming that land permanently. Once that well's drilled and producing water, he'll use it as proof the land was always his. We'll lose everything. Robert, who handled the business side, added, "We can't afford lawyers, already spent $3,000 on the court case that went nowhere. Even if we could afford it, by the time it's settled, he'll have documented years of water production. Judge will rule in his favor just based on established use." Carl, always worried about money, said what they were all thinking. "We can't let him finish that well. If we do, we lose half our timber rights, lose access to the spring, lose value on every acre we own. Can't sell land with disputed water rights, can't pass it to our kids. Everything Granddad built, everything Dad protected, gone because Eugene decided to drill on our property." Daniel, who lived alone and thought in simpler terms, asked the question Russell had been avoiding. "So what do we do? Fill in his well? That'll start a war. Maybe someone gets shot. Then we're all in prison." Russell sat in his grandfather's chair, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, staring at the floor. Martha stood in the kitchen doorway, listening, knowing where this conversation was heading and powerless to stop it. She'd seen that look on Russell's face before, in 73 when a timber buyer tried to cheat them, in 78 when a county official demanded bribes. Russell had a line, and once someone crossed it, he didn't negotiate, didn't compromise, didn't back down. "Eugene made his choice," Russell said finally. "He decided our families can't coexist anymore. He decided to take what's ours. He knows what that means in these mountains." William, the most level-headed brother, tried reasoning. "Russell, you're talking about something we can't take back. Eugene's got 8 men on his side, counting his boy. We've got 7. People will die, maybe all of us. Is 100 feet of land worth that?" Russell looked at his youngest brother with eyes that had gone cold and distant. "It's not about 100 feet. It's about Eugene thinking he can steal from us because the law won't stop him. It's about what happens if we let him get away with it. Every boundary on our property becomes negotiable. Every neighbor starts thinking they can take what's ours because we're too weak to defend it. We lose that spring, we lose everything. Our land becomes worthless. Our kids inherit nothing." Thomas, still trying to prove himself, sided with Russell immediately. "Dad would have never let someone drill on his land. Granddad neither. We let Eugene finish that well. We're saying we're not McKenzies anymore." The discussion continued for 3 hours. Martha brought coffee, said nothing, her face pale with understanding of what her husband was planning. By 11 p.m., the decision had been made, not through voting or consensus, but through the silence that fell when Russell laid out his plan. None of the brothers argued anymore. None suggested alternatives. They just sat, smoking, drinking coffee, accepting what was coming. Russell's plan was methodical, almost mathematical in its precision. They would move on September 18th, a Saturday, when Eugene's crew wouldn't be working but would be home with their families. They would use the tools they knew best, chainsaws and rifles, weapons they'd handled their entire lives. They would work quickly, systematically, giving no warning and accepting no surrender. They would eliminate every adult male, Pritchard who could contest the land claim or seek revenge. Eugene, his brothers, his son, all of them. 16 men in total based on Russell's count. The brothers left Russell's house at 1 a.m. William stayed behind, pulling Russell aside on the porch. "You understand what you're asking us to become? We're not soldiers anymore. We're not in Vietnam. These are people we've known our whole lives." Russell lit another cigarette, stared into the darkness. "I know exactly what I'm asking. And I know exactly what happens if we don't." September 18th arrived with fog so thick you couldn't see 50 feet ahead. Temperature was 63 degrees at 4:30 a.m. when Russell and his 6 brothers gathered at his house. They'd spent the previous week preparing equipment, studying patterns, mapping routes. Each brother knew his assignment, knew which Pritchard household he was responsible for, knew the layout of the property and the daily routines of the men inside. They drove 3 trucks, leaving through different routes to avoid suspicion, parking in locations they'd scouted days earlier. Russell and James headed to Eugene's house, a 2-story farmhouse Eugene's grandfather had built in 1927. They parked half a mile away, walked through timber they'd logged as boys, following paths they knew even in darkness and fog. Each carried a chainsaw with a 30-inch bar, freshly sharpened, fuel tanks full. Russell also carried his deer rifle, a Remington 730-06, with 5 rounds in the magazine. They reached Eugene's house at 4:45. Lights were off. Eugene's truck sat in the driveway. Russell could see smoke rising from the chimney, meaning someone had stoked the wood stove before bed. He and James circled the house, checking windows, confirming Eugene was alone. His wife Carol had driven to Missouri 3 days earlier to visit her sister, a detail Russell had confirmed through careful observation. At exactly 4:47, Russell pulled the starter cord on his chainsaw. The engine caught immediately. roaring in the pre-dawn silence. Before Eugene could react, before he could fully wake and understand what that sound meant, Russell cut through the kitchen door. The blade went through the wooden door in seconds, creating an opening large enough to reach through and unlock it from inside. Eugene appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing pajama pants and nothing else, still half asleep, confused by the chainsaw sound. He saw Russell standing in his kitchen, saw the chainsaw, saw James behind him with another saw, and understanding flooded his face. He tried to run toward the back bedroom where he kept a shotgun in the closet. Russell dropped the chainsaw, raised the rifle, and fired once. The shot hit Eugene in the upper back, severing his spine, dropping him immediately. He fell forward, gasping, paralyzed, bleeding onto the kitchen floor he'd installed himself in '79. Russell stood over him, watching. Eugene tried to speak, tried to ask why, tried to reach toward the bedroom where his son's baby pictures hung on the wall. He died at 4:51 a.m., 4 minutes after the chainsaw started, never understanding that his decision to drill a well had set this in motion. At 4:53 a.m., while Eugene Pritchard's body cooled on his kitchen floor, Robert and Carl McKenzie approached the home of Marcus Pritchard, Eugene's oldest brother, who lived 1 mile east in a single-story house with his wife Linda and their 2 adult sons. Robert knew the layout intimately. He'd helped Marcus build an addition to the house in 1974, back when the families still cooperated on major projects. They entered through the back door, which Marcus never locked, a mountain custom based on trust that no longer applied. Marcus was sitting at his kitchen table drinking coffee, preparing for an early morning trip to Harrison for supplies. He saw Robert first, recognized him in the dim light from the overhead bulb, started to smile in confusion before he saw the rifle. Carl shot him twice in the chest with a 12-gauge shotgun from 15 feet. Marcus died instantly, falling backward in his chair, coffee cup still in his hand, shattering on the floor. Linda Pritchard ran from the bedroom screaming. Robert let her run past him, out the back door, into the fog. They'd agreed beforehand. Women and children were not targets, only adult males. Linda disappeared into the woods in her nightgown, barefoot, running toward the nearest neighbor 2 miles away. By the time she reached help, 14 more men would be dead. At 5:07 a.m., Thomas and Daniel McKenzie reached the logging camp where Frank, David, and Leonard Pritchard lived in a bunkhouse they'd built near their timber operation. The 3 brothers shared the space during the work week, going home to their families on weekends. Saturday morning meant all 3 were there, sleeping in bunks arranged along the walls of the single room. Thomas entered first, carrying a Ruger Mini 14 rifle. The 3 Pritchard brothers woke to the sound of the door opening, disoriented in the darkness. Thomas fired 11 shots in 17 seconds. Frank Pritchard died in his bunk, 3 rounds in the torso. David made it to his feet before 2 shots hit him in the chest and abdomen. He fell against the wall, bleeding, dying slowly over the next 9 minutes while Thomas and Daniel stood watching, making sure. Leonard reached the back window, got it half open, before Daniel shot him with a .30-30 Winchester. The round hit Leonard in the lower back, dropping him across the windowsill. He hung there, half in and half out of the building, crying for his wife Sarah, calling her name until blood filled his lungs and he drowned in it. He died at 5:21 a.m., 14 minutes after the shooting started. At 5:35 a.m., William McKenzie, the brother who'd argued against this plan, the one who'd tried to find another way, parked his truck near the home of Carl Pritchard, Eugene's 37-year-old brother. Carl lived alone in a trailer after his divorce, working odd jobs and drinking too much. William had known Carl since they were children, had attended his wedding in 1973, had gotten drunk with him at a funeral in 78. William sat in his truck for 4 minutes, engine off, watching the trailer through the fog. He could leave. He could drive away and claim he'd lost his nerve or couldn't find the place. But Russell would know. The family would know. And Carl would eventually learn what happened to his brothers and would come hunting for revenge. There was no middle ground anymore, no way to only participate a little in mass murder. William walked to the trailer door and knocked. Carl answered wearing jeans and a work shirt, surprised to see a McKenzie at his door, immediately suspicious. "What do you want, William?" "Need to talk to you about the boundary dispute. Found some old documents you should see." Carl stepped outside, and William shot him once in the head with a 9mm pistol. Carl fell on his own front steps, dead before he understood he'd been tricked by a man he'd once considered a friend. William stood over the body, shaking, wanting to vomit but holding it together, fulfilling the assignment Russell had given him because that's what McKenzies did. They finished what they started. At 6:15 a.m., Russell and James moved to the home of Raymond Pritchard, 35 years old, married to Grace, with 3 children under 10. The children were in the house. Russell and James waited outside, hidden in the tree line, watching through windows. At 6:48, Raymond stepped onto his porch to smoke a cigarette, part of his morning routine. He was wearing work boots, jeans, and a flannel shirt. He'd kissed his wife and children goodbye, planning to spend the day repairing fence line. James shot him from 80 yards with a scoped rifle. The round hit Raymond in the throat, severing his carotid artery. He collapsed on the porch, bleeding out in less than 2 minutes, while his wife screamed inside the house and his children cried. Grace Pritchard ran outside, saw her husband dying, saw nothing else in the fog and darkness. She dragged Raymond's body inside, locked the doors, and called the sheriff. But Sheriff Tom Bradley was 40 miles away, and his department consisted of himself and 2 deputies covering 823 square miles. By 8 a.m. on September 18th, 7 Pritchard men were dead. Stephen Pritchard, 33 years old, the youngest brother, had been visiting his mother when the killing started. He heard the shots at Raymond's house, heard Grace's screaming, and understood immediately what was happening. He ran to his truck, drove to the logging camp, found his brothers Frank, David, and Leonard dead in the bunkhouse. He drove to Eugene's house, found Eugene dead on the kitchen floor in dried blood. Stephen was the only adult male Pritchard who'd been elsewhere when the McKenzies struck. He drove to Harrison, walking into the state police barracks at 9:35 a.m. Covered in his brother's blood, incoherent with rage and grief. He told Trooper First Class Daniel Webster that his family had been massacred. Webster initially thought Stephen was drunk or mentally unstable until he called Sheriff Bradley, who was already en route to the Pritchard properties. after Grace's call. But Stephen didn't wait for law enforcement. By noon, he'd returned to Newton County with his wife's brother, Michael Dawson, 31, and two cousins from Missouri, Pritchard relatives who'd driven in after hearing the news. They were armed with hunting rifles and shotguns, looking for McKenzies, operating on the same logic Russell had used. Eliminate the threat before it eliminates you. At 1:15 p.m., they found Daniel McKenzie at his cabin. Daniel was alone, cleaning his rifle, still wearing clothes stained with Pritchard blood. Stephen shot him through the cabin window. Daniel fell, wounded in the shoulder, crawling toward his bedroom where more ammunition waited. Michael Dawson entered the cabin and shot Daniel twice more with a 12-gauge. Daniel died at 1:22 p.m., 37 hours after his brothers had started killing Pritchards, 8 hours after he'd watched Leonard Pritchard drown in his own blood. At 2:47 p.m., the Pritchard group found Thomas McKenzie on a logging road, driving back to Russell's house. They forced him off the road, surrounded his truck, and fired 17 shots through the windshield and doors. Thomas died behind the wheel, his body riddled with buckshot and rifle rounds. He was 43 years old, married with 2 children, a veteran who'd served in Vietnam with his brother Russell, and he died without firing a shot in his own defense because his rifle was in the truck bed, out of reach. At 4:35 p.m., Carl McKenzie, who'd killed Marcus Pritchard that morning, was ambushed at his home. Stephen's group had learned the McKenzie patterns, knew where each brother lived, knew they had to move fast before the state police locked down the area. They approached Carl's house from multiple directions. Carl saw them coming, barricaded himself inside, and fired back through windows. The firefight lasted 23 minutes. Carl had ammunition in defensive positions, but he was outnumbered and surrounded. Stephen's cousin fired a shotgun through the back door, hitting Carl in the legs. Carl fell, unable to stand, still firing his rifle from the floor. Michael Dawson entered the house through the front door and shot Carl in the chest at close range. Carl McKenzie died at 4:58 p.m., bleeding out on his living room floor while state police sirens wailed in the distance. 3 McKenzie brothers dead within 5 hours. The retaliation had been swift and brutal. But Stephen Pritchard wasn't finished. He knew Russell McKenzie was the architect of the massacre. Russell had started this. Russell needed to die. Everything else was just momentum. By nightfall on September 19th, state police had established roadblocks on every major route through Newton County. Troopers Webster and Charles Morgan, along with Sheriff Bradley, were attempting to locate Russell McKenzie, who'd disappeared into timber country he'd known since childhood. FBI agents from Little Rock were en route. The National Guard had been alerted. What had started as a family dispute had escalated into the largest manhunt in Arkansas history. September 20th dawned cold and clear. Temperature was 58 degrees at sunrise. The fog had lifted. Stephen Pritchard and his remaining group, now down to just himself and Michael Dawson after the cousins had been arrested at a roadblock, were hiding in the woods near the disputed spring. Stephen knew Russell would come there eventually. The spring was the center of everything, the source of the conflict, the reason 16 men were now dead. At 7:42 a.m., Russell McKenzie emerged from the tree line. He was alone, carrying his rifle, walking slowly like a man who knew this was the end. He saw Stephen waiting by the spring, saw Michael Dawson positioned behind a fallen log 30 yards away. He could have shot them both, could have killed Stephen from cover. But Russell was tired. He'd spent 2 nights in the woods, cold and hungry, thinking about what he'd done, about Eugene's face when he died, about his own brothers Thomas, Daniel, and Carl, who died because he'd asked them to kill. Russell walked to the spring's edge, knelt down, put his rifle on the ground, and filled his canteen with water. He drank deeply, the limestone filtered water, cold and clean, the same water his grandfather had drunk, the same water that had sustained the McKenzie family for 94 years. He looked at Stephen across the spring. Your brother drilled on my land. He knew what that meant. Stephen raised his rifle, aiming at Russell's chest. 16 men dead, over 100 feet of dirt. Was it worth it? Russell nodded slowly. Ask me again when we're both in hell. Stephen Pritchard's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, State Police Trooper Daniel Webster emerged from the tree line with his service weapon drawn, shouting commands that echoed across the hollow. Michael Dawson dropped his rifle immediately, raising his hands. Stephen hesitated for 3 seconds, the longest 3 seconds of his life, staring at Russell McKenzie across the spring that had caused all of this, weighing revenge against survival. He lowered his rifle at 7:46 a.m. on September 20th, 1982, ending the bloodiest family conflict in Ozark history. Russell McKenzie stood slowly, hands visible, making no move toward his rifle. Webster approached carefully, backup arriving behind him. 4 more troopers spreading through the woods. Russell was arrested without resistance at 7:51 a.m., handcuffed, and led to a patrol car parked on the logging road a quarter mile away. Stephen Pritchard and Michael Dawson were arrested simultaneously, charged initially with the murders of Daniel, Thomas, and Carl McKenzie, though those charges would later be modified. By noon, Newton County had been transformed into a crime scene of unprecedented scale. Arkansas State Police had brought in 26 troopers from surrounding counties. FBI Special Agent Raymond Cross arrived from Little Rock with a team of 6 agents. The Newton County Sheriff's Office, overwhelmed and understaffed, coordinated with state authorities to secure 7 different locations where bodies had been discovered. 14 dead in the initial McKenzie assault. 3 McKenzies dead in the Pritchard retaliation. Eugene Pritchard Jr., who'd been working on the drilling rig with his father when Russell had confronted them on August 12th, found dead in his home, killed by James McKenzie at 5:53 a.m. on September 18th, while his pregnant wife hid in the basement. 16 bodies total across 12 square miles of Ozark forest. The investigation took 4 months. State police interviewed 117 witnesses, documented 7 crime scenes with thousands of photographs, collected ballistic evidence from 43 spent shell casings and 14 firearms. The timeline was reconstructed through witness testimony, autopsy reports that determined precise times of death, and the McKenzie brothers' own statements, which were surprisingly forthcoming. Russell McKenzie, when questioned by FBI Agent Cross, provided a detailed account of the planning, the execution, and the reasoning behind every decision. He showed no remorse, expressed no regret, and maintained consistently that Eugene Pritchard had forced his hand by drilling on McKenzie land. The trial began on March 7, 1983, in Jasper, Arkansas, but was moved to Harrison after defense attorneys argued successfully that Newton County's small population made an impartial jury impossible. Every potential juror knew someone involved, had an opinion about the boundary dispute, or had relatives connected to either family. The prosecution was led by Arkansas Attorney General Steve Clark, who'd taken personal interest in the case due to its brutality and complexity. Defense attorneys included some of Arkansas's most experienced criminal lawyers, drawn to the case by its moral ambiguity and the questions it raised about property rights, family loyalty, and the limits of self-defense. Russell McKenzie was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. Eugene, Marcus, Frank, David, Leonard, Raymond, Eugene Jr., and conspiracy charges for the deaths his brothers had committed. James McKenzie faced 7 counts. Robert, Carl, William, and the deceased brothers were charged posthumously or in absentia. The prosecution's case was straightforward. 16 men were dead, killed in a planned, coordinated assault. Premeditation was evident in the planning, the coordination, the systematic targeting. The defense argued that Russell had acted to protect property that law enforcement and courts had failed to protect, that mountain culture recognized certain violations as justifying extreme response, that the legal system's failure to resolve the boundary dispute had created the conditions for violence. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Testimony included surviving family members from both sides, law enforcement officials, surveyors who explained the boundary confusion, and expert witnesses on Ozark culture and property law. Martha McKenzie testified about her husband's state of mind, his desperation as he watched the well being drilled, his belief that losing the spring meant losing everything. Carol Pritchard, Eugene's widow, testified about finding her husband's body, about the terror of knowing her entire family had been targeted, about the grandchild who would grow up never knowing his grandfather. The jury deliberated for 8 hours over 2 days. They returned guilty verdicts on all counts for Russell McKenzie. James McKenzie was also convicted on multiple murder counts. The sentencing phase revealed the complexity judges and juries faced. Arkansas law provided for capital punishment in cases of multiple murders with aggravating factors. The prosecution argued for death sentences. The defense argued for life imprisonment, citing the property dispute's history, the legal system's failure to resolve it, and the cultural context that made Russell's actions, while illegal, understandable within mountain codes of honor and property protection. Judge Harold Mitchell, the same judge who'd presided over the original boundary dispute case, handled sentencing. He sentenced Russell McKenzie to life in prison without possibility of parole on each count. Sentences to run consecutively, ensuring Russell would never leave prison alive. James McKenzie received a similar sentence. Robert McKenzie, who'd killed Marcus Pritchard, received life with possibility of parole after 40 years. William McKenzie, who'd killed Carl Pritchard, received 30 years with parole eligibility after 15. The judge, citing William's obvious reluctance and his attempts to prevent the massacre. Stephen Pritchard and Michael Dawson faced complicated legal situations. They'd killed 3 men but had acted in response to their family's massacre, creating a self-defense argument prosecutors found difficult to counter. After extensive negotiations, Stephen pled guilty to voluntary manslaughter in the deaths of Daniel and Thomas McKenzie, receiving a 15-year sentence. Michael Dawson pled guilty to second-degree murder in Carl McKenzie's death, receiving 20 years. Both men expressed remorse during sentencing, stating they'd acted in rage and grief, not premeditation, distinguishing their actions from Russell's calculated assault. The property dispute that had triggered everything was resolved by court order in October 1983. Judge Mitchell ruled that the disputed land and the spring would be seized by the state of Arkansas through eminent domain, compensating both families at fair market value and incorporated into the Buffalo National River Watershed Protection Zone. Neither family would ever own the spring. Neither family had won. The well Eugene Pritchard had been drilling was filled with concrete and capped permanently. The spring continues flowing to this day, 5 gallons per minute, feeding into the Buffalo River, untouched by human hands, protected by federal law, a monument to the futility of the violence committed in its name. The legal aftermath extended far beyond the criminal trials. Civil lawsuits filed by surviving family members against each other created a second wave of litigation that consumed years and drained what little resources remained. Grace Pritchard, Raymond's widow, sued the McKenzie estate for wrongful death, seeking damages to support her 3 children. Carol Pritchard filed similar suits. Martha McKenzie, who'd lost 3 sons and a husband to prison, countersued, arguing her family had been destroyed by Eugene's illegal drilling and subsequent retaliation. These civil cases were eventually consolidated and settled out of court in 1986. Both families agreed to drop all claims against each other, recognizing that continued legal warfare would only enrich lawyers while further impoverishing families already devastated by loss. The settlement included provisions preventing either family from profiting from the story through book deals, movie rights, or media appearances, an unusual clause designed to prevent commercialization of tragedy. The economic impact on Newton County was substantial. Property values in the affected area dropped by 40% as potential buyers avoided land associated with mass murder. The timber industry in that section of the county collapsed entirely as logging companies refused to operate in an area where workers feared renewed violence. The school system struggled with trauma counseling for children who'd lost fathers, uncles, and cousins. The community's reputation suffered nationally as media coverage portrayed Newton County as a lawless backwater where family feuds ended in massacre. Martha McKenzie lived in the family home until 1994, maintaining the property alone, visiting Russell in prison once per month at the Varner Unit Supermax facility in Grady, Arkansas, a 4-hour drive each way. She never remarried, never spoke publicly about the case, and died of a heart attack in January 1995 at age 62. Her obituary mentioned she was survived by 1 son, Russell Jr., and made no reference to the events of September 1982. The weight of what her husband and sons had done had aged her rapidly. Friends who knew her before the massacre described a vibrant, strong woman. Friends from her final years described someone hollowed out, moving through life mechanically, waiting for death. Russell Jr. McKenzie, who'd been working with his father in the timber business but hadn't participated in the massacre because Russell had deliberately excluded him from the planning, struggled with guilt and identity. How do you reconcile being the son of a mass murderer with your own sense of self? He changed his name legally in 1987 to Russell Hendricks, using his mother's maiden name, moved to Missouri, and worked construction for 30 years. He married in 1990, had 2 children, and never told them about their grandfather until they were adults. When they learned the truth in 2008 after finding newspaper articles online, both children struggled with depression and therapy, the trauma rippling through generations. Sarah McKenzie, Russell's daughter who'd been teaching school, lost her job when parents demanded her removal, fearing she shared her father's violent tendencies. She moved to Texas in 1984, worked as a secretary, never married, and lived a quiet, anonymous life, terrified that someone would discover her connection to the Ozark massacre. Michael McKenzie, Russell's son, who'd been working the timber business, developed severe PTSD and substance abuse issues. He died in 1993 of a drug overdose. Intentional or accidental, no one could say definitively. Rebecca, the youngest daughter, married and moved to California, severing all contact with Arkansas and refusing to discuss her family history even with her own children. The Pritchard family suffered parallel devastation. Carol Pritchard never recovered from finding Eugene's body. She developed severe anxiety and depression, was institutionalized briefly in 1984, and died in 1999 from complications of alcoholism. She was 64 years old. Eugene Jr.'s widow, Jessica, gave birth to their son, Eugene Pritchard III, in November 1982. She raised him in Missouri, far from Newton County, and told him his father had died in a logging accident. He didn't learn the truth until he was 18, when a cousin told him the real story. Eugene III joined the Army, served in the Gulf War, and died in a training accident in 1995, leaving some family members to wonder if the death was truly accidental, or if the weight of his family's history had become unbearable. Linda Pritchard, Marcus's widow, who'd escaped into the woods that September morning, developed severe PTSD and never spent another night in Newton County. She moved in with her sister in Tennessee, worked at a grocery store, and died in 2006 at age 73, still experiencing nightmares about chainsaws and gunshots. Grace Pritchard, Raymond's widow, remarried in 1987 to a man from Missouri who had no connection to the case. Her children grew up knowing their father had been murdered, but never fully understanding why. 2 of her 3 children developed anxiety disorders. 1 struggled with depression throughout his adult life. Stephen Pritchard, who'd killed 3 McKenzies in retaliation, served 11 years of his 15-year sentence before being paroled in 1994. He emerged from prison changed, quieter, haunted by what he'd done and seen. He moved to Oklahoma, worked as a mechanic, attended church regularly, and attempted to rebuild his life. In a 2009 interview with a local newspaper, the only interview he ever gave, Stephen said, "I killed 3 men because they killed my brothers. But killing them didn't bring my brothers back. Didn't heal anything, just created more widows, more orphans, more people carrying weight they can't put down. If I could go back, I'd let the law handle it. Prison's easier than living with what I did." The children of the massacre, those who'd lost fathers and uncles, grew up in the shadow of violence they didn't cause and couldn't understand. Psychologists who studied the families in the 1990s identified patterns of intergenerational trauma, difficulty trusting others, hypervigilance, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and relationship problems that persisted decades after the events. Some left Arkansas and never returned. Others stayed, attempting to reclaim normalcy in communities that would never forget. All carried scars that never fully healed. The physical properties where the massacre occurred were abandoned quickly. Eugene Pritchard's house, where he died on his kitchen floor, stood empty for 3 years before vandals broke windows and stripped copper pipes. The house was demolished in 1986. The property changed hands 4 times between 1987 and 1995, with each owner attempting to develop it and failing, either due to financing issues or the property's reputation. Today, it's part of the Buffalo National River Corridor, protected federal land where hiking trails pass within 100 yards of where Eugene's house once stood. Hikers walk past completely unaware that they're crossing ground where a man was shot in the back while fleeing toward his bedroom. Marcus Pritchard's house, where Linda had run screaming into the fog, was purchased by his daughter in 1990, but she couldn't bear to live there. She sold it in 1992 to a family from Little Rock, who knew nothing of its history. They lived there for 6 months before neighbors told them what had happened. They moved out immediately, taking a financial loss, unable to sleep in rooms where murder had occurred. The house was eventually demolished in 2003. The land remains empty, overgrown with cedar and oak, completely unmarked, except by those who remember. The logging camp where Frank, David, and Leonard Pritchard died became the focus of local ghost stories. Teenagers claimed to hear screams from the woods, to see lights where the bunkhouse had stood, to feel overwhelming dread when approaching the site. Whether these experiences were genuine, supernatural phenomena or psychological responses to knowing 3 men had been gunned down in their bunks, the effect was the same. The logging camp was dismantled in 1985. The land was purchased by the U.S. Forest Service in 1994 and incorporated into the Ozark National Forest. Today, it's dense woodland with no indication that buildings ever existed there, no memorial, no marker, nothing to suggest that 3 brothers died violently in a dispute over water. Raymond Pritchard's home, where he'd been shot while smoking on his porch, was sold by his widow Grace in 1986. The new owners lasted 2 years before selling. Subsequent owners reported feeling uncomfortable in the house, experiencing nightmares, hearing unexplained sounds. The house was torn down in 2001. A mobile home sits on the property now, occupied by people who moved to Newton County in 2015 and know nothing of the massacre, sleeping peacefully where Raymond had bled out while his children cried inside. The McKenzie properties faced similar fates. Russell's house, where he'd planned the massacre with his brothers, where Martha had stood in the kitchen doorway knowing what was coming and unable to stop it, remained occupied by Martha until her death in 1995. After that, it sat empty. Russell Jr. tried selling it in 1996 but found no buyers. The house was vandalized repeatedly, became a gathering spot for teenagers drinking and doing drugs, and finally burned down in 2002 under suspicious circumstances. Fire investigators ruled the cause undetermined but suspected arson. Today, only the foundation remains, slowly being reclaimed by forest. Locals avoid the site, claiming the area feels wrong, heavy, as if the violence that was planned there left a permanent stain. Daniel McKenzie's cabin, where he'd been shot through the window while cleaning his rifle, was abandoned immediately after his death. No one wanted it. The cabin collapsed during a windstorm in 1998. Thomas McKenzie's house was sold by his widow in 1985 at a significant loss. Carl McKenzie's house, where he'd barricaded himself and died in a firefight, was purchased by a cousin in 1988 who demolished it immediately, unable to tolerate the building where Carl had bled to death on the living room floor. The disputed spring, the source of all the conflict, the reason 16 men died, continues flowing as it has for thousands of years. After the state seized the property in 1983, the area was fenced off and posted with no trespassing signs. The spring flows into the Buffalo River, contributing its 5 gallons per minute to a waterway that supports recreation, tourism, and wildlife. Kayakers and canoers float past the spring's outlet without knowing its history, without understanding that the clear, cold water they admire was considered worth 16 lives by men who died defending or attacking it. Local environmental groups conduct regular water quality testing at the spring. Biologists study the unique ecosystem it supports. Geologists examine the limestone formations that create it. None of these scientific endeavors acknowledge the human cost paid in its name. The well Eugene Pritchard had been drilling, the catalyst for everything, remains capped with concrete buried under 3 feet of soil. Metal detectors occasionally pick up the steel casing, but the site is otherwise unmarked and forgotten. Newton County changed after the massacre, but not permanently. Immediately afterward, people were kinder to each other. Property disputes were settled quickly, quietly, before they could escalate. Neighbors checked on each other, offered help more readily, remembered that everyone was struggling, and that desperation could transform anyone into something they never thought they'd become. Churches filled on Sundays as people sought meaning in tragedy, attempted to understand how their community had produced such violence. But the change wasn't permanent. Within a decade, new people moved in who didn't know the story, didn't understand the lessons written in blood across 12 square miles of forest. Old patterns reemerged. Disputes over boundaries, water rights, timber access resurfaced, though never again escalating to violence on the scale of September 1982. The economic pressures that had driven Russell McKenzie to murder never really left. They just evolved, adapted, found new forms. The timber industry continued declining. Unemployment remained high. Young people continued leaving for opportunities elsewhere. Human nature being what it is, the lessons faded like morning fog burning off the mountains, leaving behind only the faint memory of something important that once seemed so clear. 42 years have passed since that September in the Ozark Mountains. Russell McKenzie died in prison in 2015 at age 84, having served 33 years at the Varner unit. He never expressed remorse, never apologized to the Pritchard family, and maintained until his death that Eugene had forced his hand by drilling on McKenzie land. His final words, according to a prison chaplain, were about the spring, about water rights, about his grandfather's legacy. He was buried in a prison cemetery, his grave marked with a number rather than a name, unmourned except by his daughter Rebecca, who attended the burial alone. James McKenzie died in prison in 2009 at age 77. Robert McKenzie was paroled in 2023 after serving 40 years and now lives in a nursing home in Missouri, suffering from dementia. His memories of the massacre mercifully faded into confusion. William McKenzie, who'd argued against the violence and then participated anyway, was released in 1997 after serving 15 years. He moved to Tennessee, worked as a carpenter, attended therapy regularly, and died in 2019 at age 82, having spent the last 22 years of his life attempting to atone for 4 minutes of violence. Stephen Pritchard, the last surviving principal in the massacre, is 75 years old now, living in Oklahoma, suffering from emphysema and the accumulated weight of decades, carrying the knowledge of what he did. In that 2009 interview, his only public comment on the case, he said something that captures the essential tragedy. 16 men died over water that's still flowing, on land nobody owns now, in a dispute that didn't matter. We destroyed 2 families, orphaned children, widowed women, all because we couldn't let go of pride and anger. There's no honor in what we did, no justice, just blood and grief, and empty houses falling down in the woods. Rural America hasn't healed. It's evolved, adapted, found new ways to struggle. Every year, families face impossible choices when systems fail them, when courts can't or won't resolve disputes, when economic desperation makes violence seem like the only option left. Every year, some cross the line. Russell McKenzie crossed, choosing vengeance over law, choosing codes over consequences, discovering too late that violence breeds only more violence. The disputed land is state forest now, part of the Buffalo National River National Park system, protected by federal law in perpetuity. The McKenzie and Pritchard timber operations are long gone, the equipment sold for scrap, the logging roads grown over with brush and saplings. The families themselves are scattered, some keeping the names, others changing them to escape the association with mass murder. At family reunions, if they happen at all, certain topics are never discussed. Children ask about missing relatives and are told vague stories about accidents and tragedies, the full truth considered too heavy to carry forward. There's no memorial in Newton County, no plaque, no historical marker explaining that this area was the site of the deadliest family massacre in Arkansas history. The Forest Service doesn't mention it in trail guides or informational materials, believing that drawing attention to violence might inspire copycat incidents or disrespect the victims. The town of Jasper moved on the way small towns do, covering scars with layers of normalcy until they almost disappear. Children play in forests where men once hunted their cousins. Families camp near springs that were once considered worth killing for. Life continues, relentless and forgetful, and somehow hopeful despite everything. But if you hike through the Buffalo River watershed on a September morning when the temperature drops to 60 degrees and fog rolls through the hollows, you might feel something in the air. Not ghosts, nothing so simple, just the weight of choices made, of codes followed to their logical and terrible conclusions, of violence done in the name of family honor that dishonored everyone it touched. The spring still flows at 5 gallons per minute, cold and clear and perfect, indifferent to the human cost paid in its name. Revenge doesn't bring back what was stolen. It doesn't restore lost honor, or heal wounds, or make anything right. It only creates new wounds, new loss, new families destroyed. Russell McKenzie defended his family's water rights and, in doing so, ensured his family would never use that water again, never pass the land to his children, never fulfill the purpose for which his grandfather had claimed it. He eliminated 16 threats to his legacy, and in the process destroyed that legacy more completely than any thief ever could have. In the end, only one question remains, one each of us must answer for ourselves. At what point does protecting what we love transform us into the very thing we're fighting against? Where is the line between standing up for what's yours and becoming a monster? And what does it say about our systems, our laws, our society, that people still face these questions in forgotten counties where courts can't help and codes demand blood? If this story made you think about justice, property rights, and the price we pay when systems fail and old codes collide with modern law, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about honor and violence, about how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary darkness when pushed to the edge. Comment below. What would you have done in Russell McKenzie's position? Where do you draw the line between protecting your family's legacy and losing your humanity in the process? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now somewhere, in forgotten places where the system has failed and desperation takes hold and ordinary people make choices they can never take back. The names change, the circumstances evolve, but the fundamental question remains: what are we willing to become to protect what we love? Until next time, remember the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. One disputed boundary, one drilled well, one desperate September morning at a time. And the line between justice and vengeance is drawn not in law books or property surveys, but in the human heart, where it's always been thinnest, always been easiest to cross, always been hardest to find our way back from. The spring still flows, the land still remembers, and somewhere in these mountains, water still runs, cold and clear over limestone, worth everything and nothing depending on who's counting the costs.